Karen screams at man in Harris hat, then learns he's the CEO of her company. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Karen Matthews strode into the bustling event space, her designer handbag swinging at her side as she scanned the crowd. She wasn't exactly thrilled to be here, some charity fundraiser or networking event her company had deemed mandatory for upper management, but she had made an appearance nonetheless. After all, maintaining the image of an engaged, high-ranking corporate executive was important. She adjusted her sleek blonde bob and smoothed down her fitted white blazer, exuding an air of self-importance as she made her way toward the open bar. She recognized a few colleagues, but she had little interest in mingling with anyone she considered beneath her. In her mind, she had worked hard to be in her position, and she wasn't about to waste time on people who didn't meet her standards. That's when she saw him. A man in his late 50s, wearing a navy suit and, most offensively, an American flag-patterned hat with the word Harris emblazoned on it. Karen's lips curled into a sneer. To her, that hat represented everything she despised. The audacity of someone to wear that hat in a space like this, her space, was simply unacceptable. Without hesitation, she marched toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice already carrying an edge of disdain. The man looked up from his conversation, his expression calm but unreadable. He was speaking with another attendee, someone who had the unfortunate luck of standing too close to what Karen was sure was a clueless, backward-thinking individual. Karen crossed her arms, her stance confrontational. "I just have to ask, why would you wear that ridiculous hat here?" She let out a dry laugh, hoping others would join in, but the room had started to quiet around her. The man blinked, unfazed. "I didn't realize I needed your approval for my wardrobe choices." "Oh, you don't?" Karen shot back with a saccharine smile. "I just think it's incredibly inappropriate. A professional event like this and you show up with that? It's embarrassing." Somewhere behind her, a nervous chuckle sounded. A few people whispered, unsure of whether they should step in or let the scene unfold. The man sighed, removed the cap, and studied it for a moment before looking back at her. "It's just a hat." "It's not just a hat," Karen spat, her voice rising. "It represents a whole lot more than that, and honestly, if you had any respect for the people here, you wouldn't be flaunting it like some kind of badge of honor." The man's eyes flickered with something. Annoyance? Amusement? Karen couldn't tell, but it infuriated her that he wasn't reacting the way she expected. "I see," he said, placing the cap back on his head. "And what exactly does it represent to you?" Karen scoffed. "Ignorance, arrogance, and frankly bad taste." The silence that followed was deafening. The man tilted his head slightly. "Interesting," he said. "And you assume all of that just because of a hat?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. We both know what kind of people wear that." Before the man could respond, someone stepped forward, a woman Karen recognized from her company's legal team. "Karen," the woman said through clenched teeth, her eyes wide with warning. "Maybe we should step aside." But Karen wasn't finished. She had already embarrassed this man and she was enjoying it. She turned to the crowd, expecting validation. "Am I wrong?" she asked, gesturing toward the man. "People like this, they just waltz in thinking they own the place, completely oblivious to the message they're sending?" A few murmurs ran through the crowd, but no one joined in. Karen turned back to the man, her arms still folded. "Do you even know whose event this is?" The man's lips curved into a slight smile. "Actually, I do." Karen scoffed. "Oh really? Then why would you show up here like this? Who even invited you?" The man gave her a long, measured look before extending his hand. "It's nice to meet you, Ms. Matthews. I'm Richard Cole." Karen's smirk froze. The name sounded familiar. Too familiar. Richard Cole. The same Richard Cole who was scheduled to address the company's executive team at an upcoming board meeting. The Richard Cole who was rumored to be a key investor in their company's future. The Richard Cole who had recently been announced as their new CEO. Karen's mouth went dry. She opened and closed it, searching for something, anything, to say, but nothing came out. The murmurs around her grew louder as people connected the dots. Richard simply smiled, adjusting his cap slightly. "And yes, I was invited." Karen's mind reeled. This had to be a joke. A prank. Some sort of elaborate setup. Her stomach dropped as she realized that everyone in the room was now watching her. The amusement in Richard's eyes had disappeared, replaced by something far more unreadable. He wasn't yelling, wasn't arguing, wasn't trying to embarrass her. He didn't have to. He had already won. Karen tried to salvage the situation. Well, I didn't mean, she let out an awkward chuckle. I just thought. Richard held up a hand. No need to explain, Ms. Matthews, he said smoothly. You were very clear. Karen felt her face heat up. She had never been so publicly humiliated before, and yet Richard remained calm, completely in control of the situation. Of course, I respect your right to wear whatever you want, Karen stammered, hoping to claw her way back from the mess she had made. Richard studied her for a moment before nodding. Good to know. And with that, he turned back to his original conversation, completely dismissing her. Karen's entire body stiffened. The power she thought she had, the smug superiority, had been stripped from her in an instant. And the worst part? She still had to show up to work on Monday. Karen barely slept the night before. The humiliation from Friday's event replayed in her mind like a broken record. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard Cole's calm, almost amused expression as she berated him. She heard the murmurs of the crowd, the awkward silence, the subtle shifts in the air as people realized what she had not, that she had just humiliated her own CEO in public. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, pulling into the company parking lot. She took a deep breath, trying to steel herself for what was ahead. Maybe, just maybe, people had already moved on. As soon as she entered the lobby, she knew she was wrong. The moment Karen stepped onto the executive floor, the energy around her changed. Conversations halted mid-sentence. People glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away, as if avoiding eye contact would protect them from her impending downfall. She could feel the judgment in the air, the collective whispers behind closed office doors. Karen pressed forward, keeping her chin high, refusing to let them see her sweat. She arrived at her desk, opened her laptop, and tried to dive into emails as if nothing had happened. But just as she clicked on the first message, a single notification popped up on her screen. Meeting with Richard Cole, 10:30 a.m. Karen's heart stopped. At exactly 10:25 a.m., Karen smoothed her blazer, checked her reflection in her compact mirror, and made her way toward the CEO's office. Each step felt like an eternity. She could feel the weight of every glance, every smirk from colleagues who had never liked her but were now thriving on this moment. She reached the glass doors of the executive suite and took a deep breath before knocking. A voice from inside answered. Come in. Karen pushed the door open, stepping inside Richard Cole's spacious office. He was seated behind an immaculate glass desk, his signature Harris hat resting on the table beside him. He barely looked up as she entered, motioning for her to take a seat. She sat, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap to appear composed. Richard finally looked up, his expression unreadable. Ms. Matthews, he said smoothly. I'm sure you know why we're here. Karen swallowed. I do, Mr. Cole. And I'd like to sincerely apologize for... Richard held up a hand, stopping her. Before we get to that, he said, leaning back in his chair, I have a question. Karen tensed. Of course. Richard studied her. Tell me, Ms. Matthews, what exactly was it about my hat that made you so angry? Karen's breath caught. She had expected a lecture, a reprimand, maybe even a written warning. But this question? She hesitated. Well, I suppose it was just unexpected given the setting, she said, choosing her words carefully. Richard nodded slowly as if considering her response. You seemed pretty certain at the time, he said. You didn't hesitate to tell me exactly what you thought. Karen's mouth went dry. Richard leaned forward. Do you know what that hat means to me? Karen's mind raced. I assumed it was a political statement, she admitted, her voice quieter now. Richard tilted his head. And yet you didn't ask. You didn't ask me what it meant to me or why I wore it. You just decided. Karen felt herself shrinking. Richard sat back. I've spent decades in this industry, Ms. Matthews. I've built companies, invested in startups, and watched people rise and fall. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that assumptions are a dangerous thing. Karen gripped the armrest of her chair, bracing for what came next. I value professionalism, Richard continued. I value leaders who can engage in conversations, not public outbursts. His tone sharpened slightly. What I don't value is arrogance. Entitlement. The inability to control one's emotions in a professional setting. Karen's stomach twisted. Richard let the words settle before sighing. So, here we are. Karen forced herself to speak. I understand, Mr. Cole. And again, I want to apologize. It was unprofessional and I regret my behavior. Richard nodded, but his expression remained unreadable. I'm not interested in apologies, Ms. Matthews. I'm interested in what you do next. Karen blinked. I'll be watching closely, he said. Your attitude, your behavior, your interactions with your colleagues. And believe me, this company has no shortage of people who can replace you if you don't meet the standard we expect. A chill ran down Karen's spine. Richard gave her one last look before gesturing toward the door. That's all for now. Karen didn't hesitate. She stood quickly, nodded, and turned on her heel, leaving the office as fast as she could without actually running. Back at her desk, Karen took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain composed. She had expected humiliation. But Richard's words, "I'm interested in what you do next," echoed in her mind. She still had a job. For now. But the way forward wasn't clear. If she wanted to salvage her reputation, she would have to prove herself. But how? She opened her inbox, scanning through her emails, when she noticed a new meeting request. Team project meeting, assigned lead, Karen Matthews. Her stomach flipped. Richard wasn't going to fire her, yet. He was going to put her to the test. Wednesday morning arrived faster than Karen would have liked. She barely had time to process the implications of Richard's decision before she found herself in the conference room, setting up for the meeting. She arrived early, dressed impeccably in a navy blue power suit, hoping to project confidence. She arranged her notes, double-checked her presentation, and waited as team members began trickling in. The tension in the room was palpable. Her colleagues, many of whom had witnessed her meltdown at the event, exchanged knowing glances. Some looked amused. Others seemed indifferent. A few whispered amongst themselves, no doubt speculating about whether this would be her last project before getting fired. Then the door opened. Richard Cole stepped in. Karen's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. He didn't sit at the head of the table. Instead, he chose a seat along the side, arms crossed, watching. Karen took a deep breath and began. She started with a formal greeting, keeping her tone professional and controlled. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We have a lot to cover, so let's dive straight into the agenda." Despite her outward composure, Karen could feel her pulse racing. She knew that every word, every movement was being scrutinized. She went over the key points of the project, making sure to articulate her ideas clearly. The room remained quiet, but not in the way she had hoped. She could feel the skepticism. Richard was still watching. Halfway through her presentation, Karen glanced up and saw Richard leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. He wasn't looking at her slides. He was looking directly at her. She kept going, pushing through the rising anxiety. When she finished, there was a beat of silence before Richard finally spoke. "Not bad," he said, his voice even. "But I have some questions." Karen braced herself. Karen nodded, trying to maintain her composure as Richard Cole leaned forward slightly. His eyes weren't filled with anger or impatience, but there was something far worse, scrutiny. He wasn't just asking questions. He was evaluating her, testing her. And she knew that every word she said next would determine whether she had any future at this company. Richard tapped a pen against the table, glancing at the notes in front of him. "You presented a solid overview of the project," he said, "but I didn't hear much about risk assessment. Given the scale of this initiative, I'd like to know what potential obstacles you've identified and how you plan to mitigate them." Karen swallowed hard. She had prepared for this. She knew risk assessment was important. But somehow, under Richard's piercing gaze, every carefully memorized statistic vanished from her mind. She hesitated for half a second too long and she saw it. The flicker of doubt in his expression. "Don't freeze. Keep going." "Well," she began, forcing a confident tone, "some of the primary risks involve budget constraints and timeline bottlenecks. Given our projections, there's a potential for supplier delays and..." "Potential?" Richard interrupted. "Or certainty?" Karen blinked. Richard leaned back again, watching her closely. "Ms. Matthews, this company doesn't deal in vague probabilities. If supplier delays are a potential risk, that's one thing. But if it's a certainty that will impact our bottom line, that's something entirely different." Karen felt her palms dampen. She had walked straight into his trap. She had to recover. "You're absolutely right," she said quickly. "We've identified a 70% likelihood of supplier delays based on previous contracts. However, to mitigate that, we've established contingency relationships with secondary suppliers who can step in if necessary." Richard nodded, but the expression on his face didn't change. "That's better." The rest of the meeting felt like a high-stakes interrogation. Richard didn't raise his voice, didn't belittle her, but with every question he asked, Karen felt the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. He challenged her assumptions, poked holes in her arguments, and forced her to defend every decision she had made regarding the project. By the time the meeting ended, Karen was exhausted. She gathered her notes, keeping her face neutral as the rest of the team filed out. Richard remained seated. Karen hesitated by the door, hoping she could escape, but his voice stopped her. "Ms. Matthews." She turned slowly. Richard folded his hands in front of him. That was adequate. Adequate. The word hit like a slap. She had worked tirelessly to prepare, had fought through every moment of doubt, and all she had earned was adequate. Richard must have seen something in her expression because he added, "You recovered well when challenged. But next time, don't wait to be challenged. If you anticipate weaknesses in your presentation, address them before I do." Karen nodded stiffly. "Understood, Mr. Cole." "Good," he said. "Because we're not done." Her stomach dropped. "I expect a revised strategy report by Friday. It should reflect deeper analysis and offer solutions that don't rely on generic contingency plans. I need to see how you think, not just how well you react." Karen nodded again, keeping her voice even. "I'll have it on your desk by noon." Richard gave a slight nod of acknowledgement before finally dismissing her. Karen walked out of the conference room, her mind spinning. She wasn't fired. But she wasn't safe either. She had 2 days to prove herself. And failure was not an option. Karen sat at her desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, but for the first time in her career, she hesitated before typing. She had always considered herself a capable professional, someone who could handle high-pressure situations with ease. But this was different. This wasn't just about a project. This was about survival. She exhaled slowly and forced herself to focus. If Richard wanted a better strategy report, she would give him one. But it wouldn't be just adequate. It would be unquestionably excellent. She worked late into the night, poring over market trends, supplier histories, and financial forecasts. She didn't just look for solutions, she created them. She drafted alternative budget models, explored new vendor contracts, and even consulted department leads to get insights she had previously overlooked. By the time she finally shut down her computer, it was nearly 2 in the morning. She went home, collapsed into bed, and for the first time in days felt something other than anxiety. Determination. When Friday arrived, Karen stepped into Richard's office precisely at noon, her revised strategy report in hand. Richard barely looked up as she placed it on his desk. "I'll review it this weekend," he said simply. Karen nodded. "Of course." She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Richard spoke again. "Ms. Matthews." She turned. For the first time, there was a glimmer of something almost like approval in his expression. "Don't disappoint me." Karen's grip on the doorknob tightened. "I won't," she said. And for the first time in days, she actually believed it. Karen spent the entire weekend on edge. Richard had taken her revised strategy report without much reaction, and now she was left waiting in limbo, unsure of what his final verdict would be. She knew this wasn't just about a project. This was about proving she belonged. The silence was unbearable. By Sunday night, she had convinced herself of every possible scenario. Maybe Richard had already decided she was irredeemable. Maybe she had overcompensated with her revisions and made it too complex. Or maybe, just maybe, she had finally met his expectations. Monday morning arrived, and Karen walked into the office with purpose, even if her stomach was in knots. As soon as she reached her desk, she noticed an email notification waiting for her. Subject: Review of Strategy Report. From Richard Cole. Her fingers hovered over the mouse for a second before she clicked. The email was short, to the point. "Ms. Matthews, your revised report demonstrated significant improvement. Better analysis, clearer solutions. This is the standard I expect from leadership. That said, we're presenting this project to the full executive board on Thursday. You will be leading the presentation. Let's see if you can meet expectations in a higher stakes environment. Richard Cole." Karen's breath hitched. She read the email again. And again. She had done it. She had proved herself, at least enough for him to trust her with something as high profile as a board presentation. But there was no time to celebrate. This wasn't just about a report anymore. She was about to stand in front of the most powerful decision makers in the company. And if she failed, it wouldn't just be Richard Cole watching. It would be the people who could end her career in an instant. Karen squared her shoulders. Failure was not an option. For the next 3 days, Karen barely allowed herself to breathe without thinking about the presentation. She analyzed every slide, refined every talking point, and practiced her delivery until she could do it in her sleep. Tuesday night, she stood in her apartment, laptop open, speaking to an empty room as if the board members were already seated in front of her. The data suggests a 45% increase in operational efficiency if we implement Phase 1 ahead of schedule. However, this comes with a necessary shift in vendor contracts, which we have pre-negotiated to prevent cost overruns. She stopped, exhaled, and closed her laptop. She had rehearsed every detail, but she knew none of that would matter if she let her nerves show in front of the board. She had to be composed, confident. She had to be better. Thursday arrived too soon. Karen stepped into the executive boardroom, armed with a carefully curated set of slides and a practiced delivery. The room was full, more executives than she had ever addressed in one setting. And then Richard Cole entered. Unlike the other executives, Richard didn't take a seat at the large table. Instead, he leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, observing. Karen's throat went dry. She took a deep breath and began. "Good morning, everyone," she started, her voice steady. "Today, I'll be outlining the strategic roadmap for the upcoming initiative, focusing on efficiency improvements, risk management, and financial projections." She clicked to the first slide. Silence. All eyes on her. She continued, navigating through each section with precision, making sure to anticipate any potential concerns before they could be brought up. Halfway through, one of the board members, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, leaned forward. "Ms. Matthews," he said, flipping through a printed version of her report. "You're suggesting a shift in vendor strategy to mitigate supply chain risks. That's a costly adjustment. What makes you so confident this is the right move?" Karen had anticipated this. She met his gaze directly. "Because we've already negotiated preliminary agreements with alternative vendors, securing cost-efficient contracts that will save us money in the long run," she said. "Additionally, delaying these adjustments could increase the risk of price fluctuations, which would have a more significant impact on our bottom line." The board member nodded slightly and leaned back. Richard, still against the back wall, showed no reaction. Karen pushed forward, keeping her pace even, ensuring her tone remained controlled and confident. By the time she reached the final slide, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. She had made it through. She turned back to the room. "In summary, this strategy allows us to maximize efficiency while maintaining financial stability. I welcome any further questions." Another silence. Then the board members started exchanging looks. Finally, one of them, a woman in a navy suit who looked like she had never been impressed by anything in her life, spoke. "Well," she said, tapping a pen against the table. "That was thorough." A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Karen resisted the urge to let out the breath she was holding. Then Richard finally moved. He pushed off the wall, stepping forward, his gaze fixed on her. "Ms. Matthews," he said. Karen braced herself. "This was significantly better than your last performance," he continued. "You were prepared, articulate, and backed up your claims with facts." Pause. "Good job." It was the first compliment he had ever given her. A small, quiet victory. The board members nodded their approval, and just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Karen had won them over. As the meeting wrapped up and executives began gathering their things, Richard approached her. She stood tall, waiting. "You proved something today," he said quietly. "You should keep doing that." Karen met his gaze, finally feeling like she belonged. "I will," she said. And for the first time in weeks, she truly believed it. As Karen stepped out of the boardroom, she could feel the shift in the air. The looks from her colleagues were different, not full of amusement or judgment, but something closer to respect. Maybe it wasn't outright admiration yet, but it was a step in the right direction. She had walked into that room with everything on the line, and she had delivered. She had spent the last few weeks proving herself to Richard Cole, but now she realized she had proven something far more important, to herself. The old Karen, the one who thrived on arrogance and entitlement, would have walked out of this meeting with a smug smirk, convinced that she had put people in their place. But the Karen who left that boardroom today felt something different. She felt earned confidence, not arrogance. She had almost lost everything, and in clawing her way back, she had become something stronger. As she reached her office, she let out a slow, steady breath and sat down at her desk. Before she could fully process everything, a new email popped up. Subject: Follow-up, Board Presentation. From Richard Cole. Karen clicked it open immediately. "Ms. Matthews, your performance today was strong. The board approved the strategy, and we will be moving forward with your recommendations. I trust you'll ensure proper execution. This isn't the end of your test. It's just the beginning. Continue proving your worth, and you'll find that expectations don't get lower, they get higher. Meet me in my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss next steps. Richard Cole." Karen read it twice, then a third time. She wasn't sure whether she should be relieved or terrified. The pressure wasn't going away. If anything, it was increasing. And yet she couldn't help but smile. She was still in the game. The next morning, Karen walked into Richard's office at exactly 9 a.m., her shoulders squared, her mind focused. Richard was at his desk, typing something on his laptop. He didn't look up as she entered, simply gestured for her to sit. She did. Finally, he closed his laptop and met her gaze. The strategy is approved. Now it's time to execute, he said. I want you leading the rollout. Karen blinked. You want me leading it? Richard nodded. You built the plan. You defended it. Now let's see if you can make it work. She felt the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just another assignment. This was a defining moment. If she pulled this off, she wouldn't just recover from her earlier mistakes. She would solidify her position in the company. I won't let you down, she said, her voice steady. Richard studied her for a moment before nodding. See that you don't? Karen left his office with a renewed sense of purpose. This was her project now. She called an immediate meeting with her team, wasting no time diving into execution. For the next few weeks, she worked relentlessly. She delegated efficiently, made decisive calls, and ensured that every part of the rollout was on track. Her leadership style had changed. She wasn't just giving orders anymore. She was collaborating, listening, adjusting. Her team responded to the shift. Where before people had worked for her, now they worked with her. And Richard Cole? He was watching everything. A month into the rollout, Richard called her into his office again. She sat across from him, waiting for his assessment. Well, he said, flipping through a report. The numbers look good. The execution is solid. Pause. You're turning out to be less of a disappointment than I expected. Karen almost laughed. This was as close to praise as Richard Cole got. She met his gaze, a small smile on her lips. I'm just getting started. Richard leaned back, appraising her. Good. Karen stood, ready to leave. But before she walked out the door, Richard spoke again. One more thing, Ms. Matthews. She turned. Next time you see a man in a Harris hat, he said, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, maybe don't scream at him in public. Karen chuckled, shaking her head. Lesson learned, Mr. Cole. And this time she really meant it. Karen walked out of Richard's office with a smirk of her own. It wasn't the smug, entitled expression she had once carried. It was something different now. Something earned. She had survived what should have been a career-ending mistake and had come out the other side stronger. More importantly, she had learned. That lesson wasn't just about keeping her emotions in check or being more professional in public. It was about respect. About realizing that power isn't always visible. About understanding that people's value isn't determined by how they dress, what they believe, or whether they fit her expectations. Karen had always thought of herself as someone at the top, looking down. But now she saw things differently. And it changed everything. The next few months cemented Karen's transformation. She excelled in leading the rollout of her strategy, proving that her success in the boardroom presentation wasn't a fluke. She refined her leadership approach, focusing more on collaboration and strategy rather than control and intimidation. People started to notice. Her team, once wary of her, now trusted her. Colleagues who had once whispered about her downfall now respected her. And even Richard, despite his relentless standards, had begun to acknowledge her growth. The shift was gradual but undeniable. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly performance reports, Karen received an email notification. Subject: Upcoming promotion evaluations. From Corporate Leadership Board. She scanned the email, her eyes locking onto one particular line. Karen Matthews, consideration for Senior Vice President, Strategy and Operations. Her breath caught. She read it again just to be sure. A promotion. A major one. Her hands tightened around her desk, the weight of the moment settling over her. A year ago she had been on the verge of getting fired. Now she was being considered for one of the highest positions in the company. Karen closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing it. Then she smiled. The official promotion decision wouldn't be made for another month, but she already knew what she had to do. Keep proving herself. Keep improving. Keep earning her place. The next time she stepped into Richard Cole's office, it wouldn't be to fight for her job. It would be to claim her future. Because this time she wasn't just surviving. She was winning. And for the first time in her career she was doing it the right way. The smart way. The way that actually mattered. The way of a true leader. Karen sat at her desk, staring at the email, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had always envisioned success, always seen herself climbing the corporate ladder. But in the past, her definition of leadership had been skewed. She had mistaken authority for power, dominance for strength. Now she understood that leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, or the person who barked the most orders. It was about influence, strategy, and trust. She leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment to take it all in. She had come so close to throwing it all away, yet somehow she had turned things around. Now, a new challenge lay ahead. The senior vice president role wasn't just another rung on the ladder. It was a massive step forward. It came with higher stakes, bigger responsibilities, and a level of scrutiny far beyond anything she had faced before. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A message from one of her colleagues, Lauren, popped up. "Lauren, heard the news. If you get the SVP role, drinks are on you." Karen chuckled, typing back. "Karen, not if, when." The confidence in her response was real. She had spent months proving herself after the disaster with Richard, and she knew she had earned this opportunity. But knowing it and securing it were two different things. She had to ensure she was the best possible choice. She clicked out of her email and pulled up the company's latest performance reports. If she was going to step into this role, she needed to own it from day one. For the next week, Karen worked harder than she ever had before. Not out of fear, not out of desperation, but because she wanted to. She reviewed every major initiative, familiarized herself with every key stakeholder, and anticipated every potential challenge the company might face in the next quarter. When the day of the final executive evaluation arrived, she was ready. The boardroom was filled with the company's top decision-makers. Richard Cole sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as always. Karen took her seat, waiting for the meeting to begin. One by one, candidates were called in for their evaluations. She watched as some walked out looking relieved while others looked shaken. She had no way of knowing what was being asked, but she didn't need to. She had prepared for everything. Finally, it was her turn. Karen walked into the room with her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. The moment she took her seat, Richard leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Matthews," he began, his tone neutral. "You've had quite the year." A few of the board members nodded in agreement, some flipping through papers detailing her track record. Karen met Richard's gaze, refusing to flinch. "I have," she responded, keeping her voice even. "And I've learned a lot along the way." Richard nodded slowly. "We're considering you for Senior Vice President of Strategy and Operations. Tell us why you're the right choice." The question wasn't unexpected, but the way he asked it, the weight behind it, made it clear this wasn't about rehearsed answers. This was about who she was now. She took a measured breath. "Because I've proven that I can adapt," she said. "Because I know what it's like to make mistakes and come back stronger. Because I've rebuilt relationships, regained trust, and learned that leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about earning respect." She let the words settle before continuing. "I know this company inside and out. I know its strengths, its weaknesses, and where we need to go next. I've already led major initiatives successfully, and I've shown that I can work under pressure. I'm not here to tell you what I think you want to hear. I'm here to tell you that if you give me this opportunity, I will not only meet expectations, I will exceed them." There was a long silence. Richard tapped a pen against the table, then exchanged glances with some of the board members. Finally, he sat back, expression unreadable. "We'll be making our final decision soon," he said. "You'll hear from us by the end of the day." Karen nodded. "Thank you for your time." She left the boardroom, her heart pounding, but not from fear. From anticipation. For the rest of the day, she focused on work, forcing herself not to obsess over when the email or call would come. She had done everything she could. Now she just had to wait. Hours passed. Then, just as she was about to head home, her phone buzzed. An email from Richard Cole. She clicked it open. Subject: Senior Vice President Appointment. "Ms. Matthews, congratulations. Effective immediately, you are being promoted to Senior Vice President of Strategy and Operations. Your leadership has been tested, and you've demonstrated the qualities we expect at this level. I trust you'll continue to prove why this was the right decision. We'll meet Monday to discuss your transition into the role. Richard Cole." Karen exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her phone. She did it. She really did it. The past year had been filled with missteps, lessons, challenges, but this was victory. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Lauren. "Lauren, I take it drinks are on you?" Karen grinned, replying quickly. "Karen, first round's mine. The rest? On Richard's corporate card." For the first time in a long time, she let herself relax. She had fought. She had learned. She had won. And now, she was unstoppable.